Digital Hammurabi is happy to announce that Dr. Bart Ehrman, James A. Gray Distinguished Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, has put together a rigorous and exciting online course titled In the Beginning: History, Legend and Myth in Genesis. It's the first in his new series, How Scholars Read the Bible, and focuses on the historical perspective of the first book of the Hebrew Bible. This is a 6-lesson course covering a variety of topics, including the Bible and morality, who wrote the Pentateuch, and the relationship between Genesis and other literature in the ancient Near East. The course is currently available for the early bird price of $34.95, and it'll stay that price until the week of the 24th of February, which is the official course launch date. After that week, the price will increase to $39.95, so if this sounds like something you'd enjoy, then sign up before then to get the best price. All of the lessons are currently available, so you don't have to wait until the 24th to access them. If you'd like to help our channel grow, then please consider using our affiliate links when purchasing online content from Dr. Ehrman. Thank you all for your continued support, and I hope you enjoy the interview. Dr. Ehrman, thank you so much for joining me again. We're here to look briefly at the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Hebrew Bible, and contains some of the foundational narratives of Christianity and Judaism. But could you please just take a minute and tell you why you think it's an important work of literature for secular people?
Right. Well, I mean, it's obviously, as you're saying, it's obviously important for Jews and Christians. It's the first book of the Bible. I think a lot of ancient literature continues to be really important, not so much to describe what actually happened. This is not giving a scientific description of how the world came into being, or of an actual worldwide flood, or about these patriarchs. Or they're stories, but they're stories that have molded the human consciousness in the West. And if you want to understand how people think in the West, whether you're a believer or not, and whether the people you're interested in are believers or not, these stories have absolutely molded how people think today. And more than that, there are things in this story, especially in Genesis, that affect us, whether we're interested in the Bible or not. The idea that that God called one people, the Jewish people, to be His people, and promised their progenitor, Abraham, that he would have multiple descendants and that they would be given the land. That's in Genesis, and it's huge. Obviously, on the political scene today, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is tied to the idea that one group of people firmly believe that this is their land by right, and so. Goes back to Genesis. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, you got to understand books like this to understand the modern world.
Thank you very much. That's a little bit about Genesis in the modern world, but how was it thought of and used in the ancient world, specifically by those who compiled it?
Well, so Genesis it's an interesting book because the traditional view in the ancient world, the traditional view is that it was written by Moses, who's this great figure who was the savior of Israel when they're enslaved in Egypt at the Exodus, and then he wrote it all down, and he wrote these 5 books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, sometimes called the Torah, and that so they understood it that way, and they understood that they just thought these are the things that actually happened, and they thought but it was more than that. It wasn't just that they're like events of the past, that now they've had history lessons about these things. These were books that shaped their lives and their ways of understanding the world. And so modern people who are influenced by science, which hopefully most modern people are not going to be looking at Genesis 1 and think, yeah, that's literally what happened. But it's trying to convey a lesson. And in the ancient world, yeah, they did think that's what happened. But more important for them was like how that guides our thinking about what it means to be human. And how we're supposed to live. How do you solve kind of the big questions in life? And these books were important, they were of central importance for that.
Thank you. And how does that then relate to early Christians? Did how they thought of and used Genesis differ from their more ancient forerunners?
So Christians used Genesis in a number of ways that would have been very different from the way Jews used Genesis. The the traditional Christian understanding of the Old Testament that started out fairly early on in the Christian movement is that Genesis was looking, and the other books of the Old Testament were looking forward to Christ and to Christianity. And so you get images of Christ already in Genesis. I mean, for example, the flood story. It's all about God saving a few people from the disaster that's coming. And in Christianity, only a few people get saved, only a remnant gets saved when the day of judgment comes. So it won't be a flood this time, it'll be a fire, but the flood is anticipating the fire. And so Christians read all of this, the book of Genesis, as pointing forward both to their Messiah and to what's going to happen at the end of time. And so what happens at the beginning of time in Genesis is paralleled in Christianity with what's going to happen at the end of time. You have a creation and then you have a destruction. And so they're set out as parallel. So that's a distinctively Christian way of looking at it.
Thank you very much. Would you speak a little bit about how the book of Genesis has been maybe misunderstood and misinterpreted over the centuries?
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, in modern times, it's misinterpreted all over the place because people have wanted to take it as a scientific book. They're really, they've argued, that you can show that there really was, on geological evidence, a worldwide flood. Yeah, no. For one thing, it's impossible. But apart from that, no, it didn't happen. And so modern people have that kind of issue. Throughout history, of course, these books are interpreted in a wide range of ways. Modern readers of Genesis, even ones who aren't taking it literally, interpret it quite differently. Modern readers, critical scholars, realize it wasn't written by one person. It's a number of sources that have been stitched together over time, that there are differences between these sources, so there are contradictions between the stories, sometimes in big ways between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 already, and sometimes in small ways, in little details. So scholars today tend to think that you've got to read the different parts of the Pentateuch in light of what that source was all about. And ancient people, and through the centuries, that just wasn't done. It really wasn't done seriously until the 19th century. And so I'd say modern critical readers of the Bible, of Genesis, read it in a very different way because of their post-Enlightenment ways of understanding the world and understanding literature.
Thank you so much. So if we turn to the actual contents of Genesis, it's going to come as little surprise to our audience to hear that there are some textual difficulties contained in the book. You obviously are a specialist in these kinds of things. Could you give us an example of one of these problems and tell us why you think it's important for people reading and using Genesis in the modern world to be aware of these?
Well, so there are two things I'll say. I mean, one thing is just about the stories themselves. As I said, you have these different sources for things. And so, like when you're looking at that flood narrative, you'll read one verse and it'll talk about how. So the idea is that there's going to be this flood. It's going to wipe out the world. Noah's going to be saved and his family. He's going to take all the animals on the ark. And so you read in one verse that he's told by God, you're supposed to take 2 pairs of every kind of animal onto the ark. And then in other sources, it says, okay, you're supposed to take 7 pairs of this kind of animal and 2 pairs of that kind of animal. Well, just a second ago, you said 2 and 2. Now you're saying 7 and 2. So which is it? Well, they come from different sources. And so you have this, so this creates certain kinds of tensions that you've got to deal with when you're reading it. But there's another completely different kind of textual problem, which is, do we even know what these texts said originally? When you're, and it works on various levels. If Moses if Moses wrote this thing, he's writing in the 13th century, but he's writing about events that happened, hundreds of years earlier. And if Moses didn't write it, we have some of the materials in Genesis are probably written in the 5th century BCE. So the 5th century, in fact, I mean the 5th. So we're talking about events that happened many, many centuries before. So how would he have any idea? But apart from that, we don't have manuscripts of this thing until many, many centuries after that. So our Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, are based on a manuscript that is from the year 1000 of the Common Era. And if it's describing Moses, in in the 13th century BCE. Our first written account is 2,000 years later. I mean, how do you know? And so that's part of the problem.
Thank you. That's one of the joyous things about working on cuneiform is that you have the manuscripts.
Well, yeah. If you got clay tablets, they're right there. You're looking at the real thing. If you're dealing with the Hebrew Bible, yeah, you're talking about somebody. And of course, throughout the Middle Ages, Jews copy things very, very accurately. I mean, but the question is, the Jews didn't start doing that until like a couple hundred years after Jesus. So how is the text being changed in the hundreds and hundreds of years before they started standardizing it? We have no way of knowing.
Thank you. So if it's unsurprising to people that there are problems with the text, it's equally unsurprising to hear that the writers of Genesis were heavily influenced by their surroundings and neighboring cultures. Can you maybe give a place where you think that comes through most strongly?
Well, I mentioned the flood story, so that's a perfect place to go to. Our oldest, one of our oldest pieces of literature from in the world is the Gilgamesh epic. And we have parts of this Gilgamesh epic that probably date back into, I don't know, 2300 BCE or something. The flood story in Genesis is it's over 1,000 years after that, 1,300 years, depending which source you're looking at after it. There's a flood story in the Gilgamesh epic that if you just change the name of the guy in the Gilgamesh epic is not Pishtim, but the name in the Hebrew Bible is Noah. But they have the same story. It's God's picked somebody, he's going to save his family, builds a big boat, puts all the animals on, and then it floods, kills everybody else. And it's like, and down to the details, it's the same story. And so I talk about this in this course that I've done. I try to show these parallels, and not just that, but the creation stories. We have examples of those. It just shows that people in that part of the world had stories that were circulating broadly, and each one told it in light of their own situation, their own beliefs and such. But it's basically the same. These are the same stories. And so this shows probably that, it definitely shows that the Genesis account is not the first time you get these kinds of stories, that in fact the authors are borrowing stories that are in their environment.
Thank you. And that's a beautiful segue into my last question, which is shameless promotion. But why do you think our viewers should take your course? What do you think what do you hope they'll gain from it?
So my course, it consists of 6 lectures just on Genesis. And even if people know nothing about Genesis, I'm not presupposing they know anything. And so I will talk about what's in there, but I'll also talk about really interesting issues that come up out of the text, because these the creation stories and the flood, these are I call them myths, and I explain what I mean by the word myth. It's God interacting with people in a story that's supposed to mean something to people. It's supposed to produce meaning. And most of Genesis are legendary stories, not about God's activities so much as about these allegedly historical people: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the ancestors of Israel. And so I talk about the problems posed by these texts, contradictions, discrepancies, and that sort of thing. I talk about who actually wrote them, our sources, where we got this information from, and I talk about their value as stories, because they are very, very important stories that I think are fantastic. The book of Genesis is a great book. If you take it literally, yeah, you're sort of missing the boat on that one. But if you understand it as story and you see how those stories work, it really is a terrific book. One of the great pieces of ancient literature.
Well, thank you so much. And I have to say, it sounds like a fascinating course. I'm with you. Genesis is one of my favorite books. So if you're watching, there will be information underneath this video, so you can go and sign up and really just get more. Thank you. Well, Nora's going to be taking the course as well.
Yeah.
So you can go and sign up and really just get more of the same. So Dr. Ehrman, thank you again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much.